Hi, everybody. This is Kate Haley with Glazer's Camera here in Seattle. Hope you're having a great week so far and enjoying spring so far. I know today it's super sunny in Seattle, and I'm excited for a break from the overcast days here, especially with some spring blooms as they are starting to pop up. So we're excited today, and actually not just today, but tomorrow too. Today we have one of two live sessions with Sony Artisan of Imagery, Colby Brown. Today's topic is on the art of storytelling, and tomorrow we're going to talk, and he's going to share his story, kind of his background in photography, and that session is titled Redefining Your Passion for Photography. And he's going to share his story, kind of his background in photography, and that session is titled Redefining Your Passion for Photography. But let's talk about today. If you tuned into these sessions before, you know we love to get questions from those of you tuning in, so please share those questions in the chat on YouTube or the comments on Facebook Live, and also maybe let us know where you're tuning in from. One of the things that's been so great about these live sessions that we've been doing over the past year is getting to know many of you in different parts of the US as well around the world. So let us know where you're tuning in from, and just be sure to share those questions. Before we get started, I want to introduce Hector, who's our regional rep and comes into the store from time to time to participate in in-person events. He's also taught some sessions with us over the past year, and he's going to actually be in the store on April 14th to show off some of the latest gear from Sony. But we'll talk about that later at the end. But Hector, you had some announcements that you wanted to share with the audience before we get started with Colby.
Yeah, so welcome everyone. Very quickly, for everyone that's attending, if you registered for this class and you're attending live today on March 31st, we've actually got some special promo offers going on for all of the students that are attending. We will send out some information with that afterwards. Unfortunately, I can't get into specifics since we're broadcasting live on YouTube and this is going to hang out for a while, but keep an eye out for that. If you happen to be joining us just through Facebook Live or YouTube Live and you didn't actually register, you still have a chance to register for tomorrow's class. So if you want to be able to take advantage of those discounts, make sure you register for that class. And then as Kate mentioned, I will be at the store in a couple of weeks showing off the new compact G lenses that we just announced last week. Things are very tiny, but
tiny.
That's all from me. Thanks to Kate and Glazers, and very excited to see Colby's talk.
Okay, thanks for that, Hector. And just a reminder, like he said, if you were registered for today's event, you'll receive a follow-up email a little bit after we close the broadcast today with those details on that offer. And please keep that to you. It's special only for people who registered for the event. If you didn't get a chance to get registered for the event, you can go to tomorrow's and register for that one. And I'll drop that link in the chat in just a few minutes once we get going live. I just want to share that we have people from Arizona, East Africa, Scotland, Montana, the UK, Canada, and of course, Seattle, and all around. So it's really great to have so many people tuning in from so far away from Seattle. So thank you for that. With that said, post those questions in the chat room, and I'm going to kick it over to Colby. Colby, let's get this started.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Hector. And thank you guys for all tuning in and watching this. This is, it's a topic I always love to talk about, this idea of storytelling. And I'll get to my presentation in just a second so you guys can look at the good information rather than just staring at myself at the camera. But I just wanted to talk about this notion of, you know, creating more impactful and meaningful images. Storytelling is a very core element when it comes to photography and cinematography as well, which I'll touch on a little bit. But it's something that I think it's really important. I'm extremely passionate about it. I'm glad you guys are watching today. And as it was mentioned, if you guys have questions about what we're talking about, please leave them in the comments. If you have questions about something we're not talking about, you can still leave them in the comments and maybe we'll get to them at the end if we have some time. So thank you guys again for watching, and let me go ahead and share my screen here. I'm gonna rotate around because my computer's obviously over here, and then we'll get going. And Kate, just let me know once I start sharing that you do see what we're supposed to be seeing. All right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and let me just get back to the Zoom. All right, and go. Sharing screen and perfect.
All
How
right,
does
we
that
see
look?
it. That looks great. Awesome.
Excellent. All right. All right. So let's get into this. So this talk, as I mentioned, is called expanding your creativity through visual storytelling. It's that idea of, as a photographer, how do you create something that's unique? How do you tell a story? How do you create something that's more meaningful? Now, for those that don't know me, I am I've been shooting photography for almost 16 years now. I've worked for companies like National Geographic. I'm a Sony artisan of imagery. I've worked for a lot of the big companies out there. And throughout the course of my career, which we talk about in more detail for tomorrow's talk, I have found myself shooting such a wide variety of subjects, from travel to cultural photojournalism, landscape, astro, and certainly wildlife has been one of the biggest focuses in the last few years. And over the course of that career, over the course of learning more about myself, learning more about what makes an image special, learning more how to be creative, I came up with this mindset, with this idea about storytelling. And it's a bit more talking about the analogy or the core elements of a story and how they relate to a photograph, but that's kind of what our presentation's about today. So, one of the core questions that I think is important, that I think a lot of people don't really think about, is what is the difference between kind of like a snapshot and a photograph? Now, to me, a snapshot is something that's very definitive. It is, I'm grabbing my cell phone or a nice camera and I'm simply taking a picture. I'm simply freezing a moment in time to look back and remember it. And there's nothing wrong with these types of images, but we need to make sure that we know what it is. So if you've ever been to Japan, to the Snow Monkey park out there outside of Nagano, it's like 2 hours from 2.5 hours from Tokyo. This is what it is. This is, it's like these amazing creatures, these snow monkeys, come down to these natural hot springs where it's been created into this park where people can observe them and photograph them. But this is a snapshot. It's like a moment frozen in time. I'm remembering the craziness of what was happening at this particular space. And then when it comes to a photograph, this to me is a photograph. This to me has something to say. And I think that's the core difference between the two. And when it comes to the digital space, I think we've kind of sometimes forgotten that, where we've kind of stepped away from this idea that a photograph is meant to be meaningful, it's meant to be purposeful, it's meant to have something more than just a snapshot. And maybe it's because we can shoot on digital cameras and we can get a SD card that can hold 10,000 images. But I think getting back to the core element of this idea of intentful or purposeful photography is kind of what my focus is, and what my focus has been for a number of years, and certainly what we're talking about. So first and foremost, the idea that photographers are visual storytellers. I think we can all understand and agree with that concept, that the visual medium of photography gives us the ability to share a moment, to share an experience, a feeling, an emotion, something that's important, something that we witness that other people might not be able to. And we have this ability to tell some sense of a story. Now, I don't know about you. I'm a huge fan of books. I read The Martian by Andy Weir, and this book, is an amazing book. I think it's actually better than the movie, which we talk about in a second. But this book was a couple hundred pages long, right? So the author of this book had hundreds of pages in order to capture your attention, to tell a complete story, and to hopefully have you talk about it with your friends, your family, or I guess mostly for it to mean something to you. And if you're in cinematography and you watch the movie with Matt Damon, which, like I said, is not bad, it's not as good as the book, but it's certainly still pretty decent. This movie ran for 118 minutes. So the director had 118 minutes to, again, do all those same things: capture your attention, tell a story, have some sense of nice culmination. Now, when it comes to photography, we don't have that luxury. We are working with a 2D medium, and oftentimes we only have a single frame that we can use in order to tell something, in order to share a moment, in order to have an impact. And I think that that's important because it makes us understand the limitations of photography, but at the same time, it also shows the power and the strength that a single image can have over, say, a movie that lasts for 2 hours or a book that's hundreds of pages long. And part of that reason is because a picture is worth 1,000 words. I mean, that's kind of an age-old saying. And it's true, because if you think about it, there's so much that you can get out of a picture, which is different than the person next to you that might be seeing that same image, which might be a slightly different than what me as the artist might have meant to say. But there's some core elements in how we create images that I think can be a thread that kind of interweaves between all of those and allows us to connect those different dots so that you as the artist have a bit more power in terms of telling that story, which again is our focus. So if we think about the idea of a typical story arc, okay, this is like how you tell a story 101. This is what you get if you took English in college. This is what you'd be studying. So typically, most stories start with this idea that you have this exposition. This is the kind of the beginning of the story. It's you're establishing who your main character is, who's your protagonist. You're getting a sense of location, a sense of place. You also have a sense of atmosphere, and through this idea of like rising action, the continuation of the plot, you're understanding tension or emotionality, and you're building towards this idea of a climax. This is kind of the part of the superhero movie where the hero, is trying to figure out how to beat the bad guy, and he's learning this stuff along the way. And after he does that, after he defeats the bad guy, you have this sense of falling action and this wrap up, this resolution. Now, the interesting thing is that with photography, unlike most books and unlike most movies, is that we really only have to focus on the first three elements: the idea of exposition, so our sense of who our subject is, our sense of location or place, controlling of atmosphere, feeling, emotion, and kind of building up towards some sense of a climax. So we're using different storytelling elements that are wrapped up in our idea of photography. And then what happens is that the viewer then applies their own sense of climax, falling action, and resolution. So it's a really unique opportunity to kind of use photography and the core elements of what we can do with our cameras out in the field and what we do in post-processing in order to control these first three elements, or at least direct the viewer along some sense of a pathway, and then let the viewer fill in the rest. And so it becomes this beautiful dance or synergy between the viewer and yourself. And if you've done it successfully, then you can bring in these elements together to create something that is unique, that's something that you can capture someone's attention when they're scrolling through their Instagram feed or Facebook or walking down, Times Square in New York, if you happen to have an image that got licensed on one of those big digital billboards. And the whole idea is that you have created this unique image, this image that has impact, that has something to say, because you have much of these different elements, like this photograph of the famous church in Vik, Iceland, with the northern lights going off behind it. The choices that I made based on subject matter and composition and exposure and atmosphere and how I process, like all these elements are all interconnected and all tied together. And that's the story that I'm trying to tell. That's the idea of the story of storytelling that we're talking about. So where do you start? Which is a great question, and something that, again, sometimes gets overlooked. To me, I think where it really comes down to it is the idea of changing your mindset. I think that, again, this idea of digital cameras, which we all love. I've been shooting Sony mirrorless cameras for 7 years now. I love the fact that, with the new A1, I can shoot 50 megapixels and fill up, tons of SD cards. But I think in that same benefit that we have of having all that technology and having all these, amazing opportunities to capture images, is that we've lost a little bit of our way in making sure that we approach photography with a bit more creativity and a bit more intent and purpose, as I've mentioned before. And so changing your mindset, slowing yourself down, which we'll talk about, I think is really important, and really trying to identify and try to figure out, why is it that you are taking any given picture? If the answer is just because it's pretty, that's great, but you're really just like a half a step away from a snapshot at that stage, unless you get really lucky, which can happen. But our idea is to try to get, lucky more often, right? To create more image, have a wider portfolio full of impactful content that then you can be proud of, and that you can, share more reality, share more, importance of what you're seeing or what you've experienced with others around the world. So one of the things that I think is key in all of this is to photograph things that you're passionate about. And that sounds fairly basic, but I think it's a really core place to start with. So for me, as I mentioned, I am a landscape photographer. I'm also other things, which we'll talk about in these other slides. But the idea of landscape to me is I love the intimacy that I get with nature. I love being out in often cold or remote climates, in challenging situations, trying to decipher light, trying to figure out how to create something that's compelling with a subject that is often exponentially larger than myself. And to me, because I love that solitude that I get, that intimacy that I get when I'm out in nature, and because I care so much about it, I put more of myself into my work, and I think that's a really important element. Again, if you find yourself shooting things that you're not really interested in, which I think a lot of us do when we're first starting out with photography, it can kind of show. And it's good to kind of do that spaghetti test where you try multiple different things until you kind of nail it down. But once you do, you'll realize where your passion is. And I think that's, that helps elevate all the different choices that we're going to talk about here moving forward throughout this presentation. Now, I also, am a travel photographer. That's kind of really what got me into photography to begin with. That's what I talk a lot about in tomorrow's presentation. And the whole idea of kind of being outside my comfort zone, finding myself in countries with customs or beliefs or ideals that are contrasted to mine, feeling out of pocket, has been something that I have absolutely loved, since I first got into photography, and even before that, going back probably 20 years when I got out of university. And to me, it's those different elements that come together to allow me to think creatively about capturing a scene like this. This is taken in Petra in Jordan. This is the famous treasury building was carved into the rock thousands of years ago, and this unique experience of they light these candles and you go down this pathway and all this stuff coming together, and then you have like a little bit of the clouds clearing above with a little bit of the ambient light from the nearby city, and you might not be able to see it on our presentation, but there's definitely stars in the sky above. And like the choices that I made out there in the field were very intentional, as purposeful, because I really cared about this moment that I was experiencing, and I wanted others to share in that love, share in that passion that I was feeling standing there. And so again, I put a bit more of myself. I tried harder. I wanted to come away with something that was special, not just something that looked nice. And then, as I mentioned before, wildlife photography is something that I have absolutely fallen in love with over the last probably 4 or 5 years. It's something that I used to shoot more so based on opportunity, where I was like, hey, I'm in Africa doing a project on a certain tribe or something. I was like, oh, I guess I'll shoot some wildlife. Where nowadays I actively put together different expeditions and different projects around the world to photograph endangered species and all sorts of amazing things happening out there. And to me, it's this love of wildlife, the challenge of working with subjects that don't cooperate. Unlike if my travel photography or portrait portrait or cultural photography, there was something unique about it that I learned from it, and it made me want to try harder. It made me want to again put more of myself into these kinds of images, to travel to further places, to do my research, to make sure I always had the right gear at the right time and try to be at the right place as often as I possibly could. And so because of that, over the years, it's helped me continue to develop and become a even better photographer, especially when it comes to wildlife, is because, again, I'm so passionate about these types of genres that I'm shooting. So moving on to one of my next recommendations, my next tips, studying your environment. This is a big one. I kind of alluded to this idea that when to slow down and to think more consciously about your choices. And that's what I think is really, really important. Oftentimes whether I'm doing travel photography, even when I'm doing wildlife, assuming I'm not doing something that's super time sensitive, or even when I get to like a big landscape like this is Godafoss in Northern Iceland, I love just kind of either sitting down or maybe even setting up my camera like I have here, but like setting it up on a tripod, or maybe keeping my camera packed away and just kind of observing the scene. Like all too often, because I teach workshops all over the globe, I'll have clients that show up at a location and they're just super giddy and excited, and they like jump out of the van or the truck that we're in. And they're running around. They're like a chicken with their head cut off, and they're shooting as much as they can because they're so excited, which is great. But oftentimes when you do that, I find that you miss some of the nuances. So kind of slowing down, studying your environment, looking at a scene like this and trying to isolate what it is about the image that we like. Is it the swirling water? Is it the color? Is it how different elements work together or work against each other? And if I don't take the time, oftentimes I find that I don't that my images aren't as strong because I'm kind of just either going through the motions or I'm going too fast. And so that's a really, really important element when it comes to photography is studying your environment, slowing down. Even when I'm photographing people in a place like Kathmandu, Nepal, I'll often have my camera tucked away in my backpack, walking around, and I'll just kind of sit at a busy square and try to observe how people are engaging and interacting. Maybe I'll try to have a conversation through someone, whether I speak Nepalese or not, like maybe through professional charades, but just try to feel a bit more part of what's happening. And like I said, I think that if you do that, it will reward you if you take that time. So who or what is your hero? This is like, again, core basic photography 101. Like, what is your subject, right? Like if you've read a photography book, if you've taken a class here, if you've studied with other photographers, like this is what a lot of people talk about. What is your subject? And I want to go a little bit deeper. I want to go a bit more almost existential, because what I think that is important here is as you look at a scene like this is taken in Laguna Marga and Torres del Paine National Park in southern Chile, and you see this scene, right? And it's a beautiful, beautiful photo. I think it's a beautiful photo. It's a panorama. It's like 202 or 300 megapixel image. When I saw this scene, I was blown away. And if you were standing there as well, you might have been blown away because it was a very spectacular morning. And you might have just taken a couple shots here or there and tried to do something unique with it, but for the most part, you're just kind of mesmerized. For me, I think you have to take it a step deeper and you have to kind of try to isolate what it is about this subject that makes it unique, because it's that idea, that origin point should dictate or at least put you on a pathway to make all the other different choices that you have out in the field. Your choice of composition, which we're going to talk about, exposure, control of lighting, atmosphere, tonality, all sorts of choices that all should stem from this initial choice of subject. And for this, it might be the reflecting, Las Torres peaks here sitting in Laguna Amarga. But if it is that reflection, that's going to dictate and change how you compose the image compared to if it was maybe the sky and what was happening, or the incoming storm coming from the left-hand side of the frame. So isolating that down and really trying to figure out what it is about your subject that you do find appealing should help give you some sense of an idea of the direction you should go with the rest of the choices that you have out there in the field. This is the same for a place. This is Grand Prismatic Geyser in Yellowstone National Park in near West Yellowstone, just south of West Yellowstone. And this is a beautiful place. If you've ever been here, these boardwalks that walk all around, and it's a really spectacular location. And I've been going there for years, and it wasn't until I started thinking about seeing this from a different perspective that I was like, okay, there's more to see here. And so what I did is I ended up hiring a plane in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and renting the plane and having a pilot fly me up to this area over the national park, because you can't fly drones in national parks. And we hovered about 5,500 feet, which is about the limit of what you can fly over a national park. And we opened up the window, and I took my 70-200 and my A7R Mark III at the time. And I began to photograph this and using a polarizer, cutting down some of the reflected light, but like it completely changed the angle compared to if I was right there at ground level. And so because it was the amalgamation of colors, because it was the symmetry of all these pieces working together, I knew once I really started exploring this particular part of Yellowstone is that I wanted to see it from above. And to me, this was the only way that I could do it because of the other restrictions there. And so knowing that that was the element that was special and unique about this particular subject, I changed the way I decided to photograph it. I had to spend more money. I had to be more involved and more committed, but I felt this was the best way in order to experience and to capture the beauty of the Grand Prismatic Spring. And the same thing can be said about people. This is a shot of a shaman in Papua New Guinea that I made a connection with. And whenever I do work like this with different types of tribes or people around the world, I'm constantly looking for those connecting moments. Like I do want candid experiences, but oftentimes I love this kind of soul piercing connection that I get with another human being. And so for this particular individual, me and him kind of made eye contact multiple times before I was able to take this photograph. And I knew there was some sense of connection. So I knew it wasn't going to be fake. I knew it was a genuine moment that I was willing to be patient and wait for in order to capture. And it was because I was knowing that this idea of connectivity is what I was looking for. That changed the way I approached the image, depending on the lens that I was using, which was the 85G Master, because I wanted this really shallow bokeh, and I was looking for this kind of headshot type look. And then how that kind of wraps around and connecting with my subject matter, being part of that narrative story. I wasn't a third party bystander that wasn't part of, say, a grand prismatic spring or something like that. It was my relationship and connection that I made that I was able to leverage in order to capture something like this that I felt was more compelling and the type of image that I was going for. So framing your story, this is something that kind of follows along the analogy, the lines with storytelling is your your plot line, right? So the plot of your story is kind of like how your sense of place, sense of where you put your subject, as well as kind of the atmosphere and general feel for things. And so to me, I think framing is a really big element of photography that, again, I think a lot of people get either confused with or that feel kind of sometimes escapes them. And so for me, like photographing this fisherman in Myanmar, the idea of zooming in close, having a really nice shallow bokeh effect in the background. I think this was shot at like f1.4 or 2.0, somewhere around there, 2.2, and then having him placed on the right hand side of the frame, and then having him look and gaze off into the left hand side, and positioning myself so that I can pull that off, allowed to create a much more pleasing image, because I was taking advantage of that idea of negative space and where the light was coming from this frame. And then kind of you have this little bit of this jungle canopy in the far left hand side of the frame. You can see that we're on some sense of a wooden bridge or walkway. And so all these different elements came together to kind of give an idea of the plot. We have the subject matter, and we're kind of placing them within this idea of our story. And so again, that was that conscious choice of like, I knew what my subject was, and then the next phase was kind of going to this idea of, how do we develop some sense of plot, of place when it comes to this shot. And so it was those choices that all stem from that initial subject of capturing a unique image of this Burmese fisherman. And same thing happens with a lot of times with landscape work. So this is taken in Lower Antelope Canyon in Page, Arizona. And this place, which used to allow tripods, doesn't anymore. I was able to kind of get in there a few years back and kind of really take my time going through the canyon, because it's such a busy spot, so that can be a challenge. But I saw this one particular scene, and it was just so unique because all the different layers of this unique sandstone that had been formed over millennia. And I really liked what I saw. But the problem was that if you're in a canyon, if you look at the very top, then it's kind of this blown out sky, because most of the time you're shooting during the midday, because you're trying to get this strong light bouncing off the sandstone and coming into the cave to kind of give this unique look. And so what I had to do is to really position myself and back myself into a corner, allowing what ended up being the top right corner of the frame to kind of engulf and overlap and create this natural framing border that you see here, allowing for myself to still capture all the different layers of the sandstone elements of this canyon, for Antelope Canyon, but also not to have these like blinding spots that were just too distracting with the sky, or having to do some like really over the top HDR, which wasn't what I was going for. And so like changing my composition of my initial idea based on what I was seeing and experiencing, because I wanted to focus on this idea of layers, allowed me to change this idea of composition and using framing as a core element to kind of really enhance that choice of subject matter. So simplifying your images, this is kind of like the idea that if you've ever gone to a movie, like at a movie theater, or maybe you rent one, you're streaming at home, and it's like a bad movie, right? And you don't know if you want to turn off the movie or if you want to walk out of the theater. You're like, this is kind of a waste of time. I think the same could be said for a photograph. If you have an overly complicated photograph, whether it's compositionally or subject matter or just distracting elements, that can drastically take away from the viewing experience and the experience of the viewer. And so for me, one of the solutions to that is to really kind of simplify things, like remove distracting elements, try to figure out unique ways in order to capture a subject where you still can create, again, that engaging image, but you don't have to worry about this idea of like a bad plot line where people are really not going to pay attention to it much more than, just flipping through their Instagram's feed. So this is a photograph taken in Brazil of a caiman, the South American version of the alligator, and they're tiny little creatures. They're generally not overly big. And I saw this little guy sitting in a shallow pond. And so what I did is I had my A9 at the time, Sony A9, and I had 100 to 400 lens on, and I essentially got right down to water level. And I had my left hand kind of cradling the bottom of the lens, and I allowed my hand to get wet with water. And then I had my hand on the back on the actual body, and then I flipped up that rear screen and allowed me to kind of get this unique perspective where I was shooting right at water level, because I knew that I was zooming in enough where I knew it wasn't going to attack me, and I didn't have anything to worry about. But I really wanted to capture this unique angle, because anything above with the higher perspective, I just got the symmetry in the reflection was too distracting. There was too many elements happening with the foliage happening behind it. And so this allowed me to simplify, remove those distracting elements, and create something unique in the process. And to me, it's one of my favorite images specifically of caiman. And it was because I was thinking a little bit outside the box in the process and really trying to just remove all those other distracting elements. And I do the same thing with a lot of landscapes as well. Oftentimes with landscape photography, I often will reach for my 16 to 35 G Master or something like it. And sometimes it's nice to throw in like a 70 to 100 or a 100 to 400 and really try to just isolate, again, simplify that idea. This was this was inside an ice cave in Iceland, and essentially zooming in and focusing on just this one little spire coming down that had been melting from this ice cave, instead of the whole grandiose nature of it, which I captured as well. But once I had those shots, I was like, let's get creative, flipped onto a 7200 in this case, and then tried to isolate and really use and control, shooting in manual mode, the exposure. So I was just focusing on the blue elements of the glacier frozen ice, and then really taking advantage of the darkness found in the rest of the cave and the light kind of filtering in from the side. So helping to direct the viewer, this again comes back to composition and good use of composition. So
hey, Colby?
This is back. Yeah, absolutely.
So there are a couple of questions came in. I thought maybe we could answer those if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
I was kind of just like listening along, and I was like, oh, let's ask these real quick. So one was on, Susan is asking, what is negative light and how do you tell that? And I haven't heard that phrase before, so could you?
Negative light. Now I said negative space. Do you think she was referring to that?
That's what she meant. Yes, I've definitely heard that one before. Okay.
Yeah.
Negative space.
So yeah, negative space, for those that are listening that don't know. So negative space is essentially space that is used that doesn't have too much of a purpose on its own. So if we go back to this image, so if you think about this image, your subject is in the right-hand side of the frame. And then the space on the left is negative space. It is space that is absent of the subject. And so if you have a ton of negative space that doesn't have any detail, that sometimes can be problematic. Or in this case, as I was talking about negative space, if I put this subject, this fisherman who is looking to the left on the left-hand side of the frame, then he would be looking off to the left-hand side of the frame, like already in the corner. And then everything behind him would just have no value. So that's kind of the idea of negative space. So proper use of negative space in a situation like this would be to allow your subject to view through the negative space so that it then has some sort of purpose, and you're taking advantage of it rather than just kind of letting it be what it is, and just means that you didn't take a great image because the composition's off. Right.
Okay, cool. And then just a super quick, it was related a little bit to some of the landscape stuff you were talking about. What megapixel range do you typically recommend for landscape photos? He's interested in printing like poster size prints. And so what, 42, 36, 50, what is the A1 is what, 60?
A1's 50, yeah, A1's 50,
Okay.
A7R, A7R2 is 61. I mean, I think it depends on a lot of different variables. But I think that if you look at a straight one-to-one comparison, it's like a 16 by 20 or 16 by 24 print is equivalent of, I believe it's like 36 megapixels or something like that.
Okay.
Now, that being said, technology is so great these days that if you have a higher megapixel camera, you have more image data to work with. So like the new Sony A1, which is I've all switched to now, taking advantage of those 50 megapixels means that if I do want to upsize an image, so I want to essentially in post-processing through Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever program that you use, that you increase that size, that you're going to have less artifacts, less issues with it. So when it comes to wanting to print big, the larger the megapixels that you can use, the more beneficial. But you do have a bit of leeway in that middle space if your camera is, say, 24 or 36 or 42. Even if you don't think you can, there's still a lot of image data that you can pull out of with your camera, and a lot of it comes down to knowing your sensors. So like when I switched from the manufacturer that I was using before I started going with Sony, I didn't fully understand the sensor technologies until I started playing with it, knowing that I have so much more leeway room when it comes to blowing things up or playing with shadows or highlights and dynamic range and stuff like that. So there's a lot of these small nuances that really come from you understanding the strengths and limitations of whatever camera that you're using. But there's a lot of opportunity to still create big prints from images that aren't naturally large megapixels, but it's exponentially easier if you're starting with higher megapixels.
Right. Of course. Okay, cool. Well, let's keep going. I just wanted to get those two questions in there. We'll have some more later, of course. Keep posting those questions in the chat, and let's get back to our presentation.
Excellent. So there, help direct the viewer. Yep. So essentially the idea of direct the viewer is, again, using compositional techniques in order to create, again, natural framing or things like that. I like to use this example because it's so blatantly obvious. This was another fisherman in Myanmar in Inle Lake. And I've been seeing these fishermen out on this lake for a number of days when I first went to go visit them back in 2013. And I was always blown away by the nets and the general feeling and atmosphere. And I took so many images of beautiful sunsets behind these guys doing their thing. But something that really drew me in was this idea of using the net itself. And the problem is that I like to go super wide when I do these things. And most of the fishing nets have like a very small opening at the very top of them that these guys use. But this individual had this massive opening when it came to his fishing net. So when we went by him on our boat, I was like checking out everyone's nets, and I was like, "Hey, this is great!" Like I asked through a translator, like, could I use this to take a photo? And this guy graciously allowed me to. And so I took my ultra wide, my 12 to 24, I think it was the F4G series Sony lens at the time, and I put it on my A7R Mark IV, and I literally just stuck it in there, went all the way wide, shot at 12. And was able to use the framing of this net to kind of really direct the viewer and kind of, look through look exactly where I wanted the viewer to look. So you can use different elements like this naturally with its framing of, tree branches or, other things within whatever type of genre of photography that you're interested in. But I think there's added benefit to kind of helping direct the viewer. It's a little bit more obvious with like landscape work when you're looking at scenes like this, where you're creating like S-curves like you have on this waterfall in Iceland on the left, or a more natural flow of like a seascape on the right, where you have the flowing water taken at sunset and kind of directs the viewer throughout the frame. And the whole idea is that specifically, like, if you took the attention to include something in your frame, you want to give the viewer more reasons to kind of spend time looking at all the details that you created. And I think that it's important, if you can, to include elements like natural framing or S-curves or leading lines that allow the viewer, it gives the viewer an excuse to say, hey, I want to start here, like in the bottom left-hand corner of the waterfall image, and kind of go with the flow of the water as it feeds out into the small little lake. And then all along the way, they're seeing all these other details that they might have missed otherwise if we didn't take this image at this particular perspective to create this natural S-curve within the shot itself. So using light and color to control atmosphere and emotion, that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's really important when it comes to photography. I mean, photography is all about controlling light, right? We're constantly trying to chase light. We're trying to control light. We're trying to leverage light. And all too often, it's that ability to control light that really controls the feeling and the atmosphere of our story, of our image, of how everything kind of comes together. And I think for a lot of photographers, as you're learning, you learn about learning the histogram, right? You learn that your histogram is a bar graph that represents, the brightness and darkness of the pixels in your frame. And you're told early on that you always need to have this nice little, mountain-like curve where you get mostly midtones in the middle of this graph. And then you don't want too much left and too much in the shadows and too much right in the highlights, which is great, I guess, when you're learning. But when you really want to create something unique, then it's the idea of controlling and capturing the right light, not necessarily just a balanced image. If I looked at the histogram of this, which I should have included, but I didn't, then it would be heavily skewed to the left. And then there would still be these bright spikes on the far right because of the candles. But I wanted to create a darker, more atmosphere, more moody-like image. And it to me was exponentially better than trying to capture a quote unquote proper histogram when it came to the shot. And that's something that is much easier to do in shooting in pure manual mode. You can get away with it in some of the priority modes, but it requires a bit more control of your exposure compensation and whatnot. But it's that idea of controlling light and dictating that mood that you can present within your images, to kind of break those rules of the histogram and other things that you learned early on to create more compelling images is really key when it comes to the creative side of things. And this is certainly prevalent in night photography. This is in Norway, the Lofoten Islands, having bright elements and dark elements. And it's more about how all these different pieces come together to control the atmosphere and feeling of the image. Now, if the lights weren't on inside these cabins, or I chose to shoot it at a different exposure and it was much more darker, you wouldn't get the same feeling. And that's what I'm talking about when it comes to controlling that idea of atmosphere, of feeling, when it comes to the image. And sometimes I really want to get like super painterly. So sometimes it's working with palettes of color, like in aspects of Torres del Paine National Park in this image, and also how I process images, where I just want to get a bit more, creative and have fun with a bit more of that process. But there's a lot of leeway that you can work within this space to create these unique styles or these unique images. And atmosphere is one of the best ways that I've found to do that. And that again often requires, controlling light and using manual, knowing that you want some good details, but you don't need details everywhere. And that's a good lesson for everyone to take heart to. So creatively capturing motion, super important. Whether you're shooting a hummingbird and trying to freeze him completely, or maybe you use a slightly lower shutter speed in order to showcase that motion of the wings, really can make a difference again in how people understand tension and motion within your shot. So your choice of shooting at 8,000 1/8,000th of a second shutter speed to 1/1000th with a hummingbird will drastically change kind of how that image is. And you might want everything frozen perfectly still, but sometimes you might want that motion. And so you want to be able to control that tension. And that's certainly prevalent when it comes to working with water and landscapes. So this is again back in Iceland at a place called Brewerfoss, and sitting here and hiking out to this location and having like small little micro spikes on to try to get to the spot without falling into this glacier-fed waterfall and river just below it, and trying to find this unique composition, and then trying to figure out what is the right shutter speed. And for those listening, one of my favorite shutter speeds to use is kind of oftentimes in that kind of 0.6 to 0.8 range, is because what it does is it gives me a really nice balance, depending on the speed of the water, a really nice balance between that idea of tension and motion, of still getting details, like you can see a bit of the details in the water, but also a little bit more of that dreamlike feel where it feels like the water is really moving at the same time. So choosing that shutter speed consciously is a very important element when it comes to certain kinds of photography, and it can have drastic effects to help people control that idea of tension, of motion, of a dreamlike look, or freezing moments in time. There's all sorts of fun options that you can get creative with out there, but it should again be that conscious choice. It should be purposeful and intentful, not so much an accident or something you fall into. So use of perspective and scale. This is the idea of things like landscape or travel images where you include a human being. This is actually me hiking there. This was taken from my friend Michael Bonacore. when we were in Torres del Paine a few years back. And the image itself was great without me in it, but once you included a human element, you can really get a feel for the size and scope of the grandeur of this part of the Southern Andes. And I think that to me really makes it unique. And without that perspective and scale, it wouldn't have been as dramatic. So if you can include elements like that, sometimes when I first started out with with landscape photography, I wanted no one in any of my subject. I wanted it just to be nature. And then over the years, I've realized that with the right placement, that can really add and elevate to help people understand just how beautiful and massive certain areas are, or small, depending on what you're photographing. And same thing can happen in a lot of different scenes out there. You have Uluru taken on the left-hand side. That's actually me in the image again, although this was a self-portrait where I set it up on like a 10-second or 15-second timer and then ran down there and got in the frame, because without it, it was a little bit bland, but giving that sense of how big I am compared to the massive nature of this spiritual mecca for the Aboriginal people in Australia, I think really helped again elevate it a bit more. And the same thing on the right. This was taken in Iceland in the wintertime, and that actually isn't me this time. But I was there with some friends, and this photographer had rolled up to the scene, and we'd hiked behind this waterfall to capture this image. And at first, I was back in my old ways, and I was like, "Get out of the shot!" Like I'm trying to scream at this guy, which of course you can't hear because the water is pounding down, and we're inside this cave, so there's like all this echo. So he couldn't hear me, and all of a sudden, I looked at the images I was getting, and I was like, "Wait a minute." No, hold still. Don't move. Because I really think that, again, with his bright red jacket and a sense of another photographer there, you again get this unique sense of just how big and unique this particular spot is in Iceland. So again, healthy use of scale and perspective, I think, can go a long way with certain types of images. So details matter. I'm kind of closing down on the last couple slides here, so I think we'll have time for questions. But details matter. So what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is that, when you look at an image like this was a picture of a gold dust gecko taken in Hawaii on the Big Island with the Sony 90 millimeter macro lens. And this particular shot, it's like full of details, right? You have this beautiful pattern on the back of the gecko, and you have all of this amazing detail found throughout the scene. I was able to get super close to them because it was taken like mid-morning when the sun had come out. And when the sun comes out and they get warm, they slow down. So it's a great time to photograph these types of creatures. But the reason that I use this is because there's so much detail in this shot. If there were other distracting elements in it, if you take a picture of a waterfall, of a seascape, of a person, and you notice this small distracting element in it, and when you look on the back of your camera on those 3-inch screens, like it might not be that big of a deal, right? And all of a sudden you send that image, let's say you send it to your phone, and then all of a sudden it's on like a 6-inch screen. And you're like, it's annoying, but it's still there. It's not that big a deal. And then the next thing you know, you're sending it to your laptop and it's on a 15-inch laptop. And then you're like, okay, it's starting to get more annoying. And then all of a sudden you're going to get home and you put it onto a 24 or 32-inch screen. And every time you viewed this image, that distracting element that you did not either remove or that you included all of a sudden becomes more of a big deal. And so when I say details matter, I have the mindset with every single image that I take that I'm going to have it blown up to about 4 feet by 6 feet. And that's not because I'm going to actually do that. I've had images, again, licensed in Times Square and lots of other places far larger than that. But having that mindset that the little details matter, because on the back of your camera, it might not be a big deal. But when you blow it up to be the size of a billboard, or when you are going to blow something up and put it into your home, all of a sudden that small distracting element, that branch that was poking through the corner, the rock that had a reflected light on it because it was wet, like whatever small little piece, all of a sudden becomes a huge deal. And so if it started out small on your back of your camera, by the time it gets onto Times Square, it's the size of myself, and I'm like 6'3". So you want to really pay attention to the details and try to choose your subject and your composition as intentfully and purposely as you can out in the field to remove those distracting elements. And then when you get to the post-processing, try to emphasize that. That's the approach that I get, where I'm trying to kind of clean up and stylize images so that I don't have those distracting elements, because if they're distracting me, they're going to be distracting other viewers. And I want people to focus on my choice of subject matter, the story I'm trying to tell, my choice of composition, light, choice of colors, which we didn't even talk about, how certain colors make people feel certain ways, like all sorts of elements in there. So you have to make sure that those details all are important and you're thinking about them in the very least. So the last little piece is that there are no rules, which is a funny thing to say after a conversation with a guy that is talking to you about all these things that you need to pay attention to. All the little bits of information that you get as a photographer, wherever you are on your creative journey, should be like reading recipes from other chefs, right? You should pick the different pieces that make sense to you, and ultimately the goal is for you to create your own, 4-course meal, or your own spectacular image. And so the advice that I give you or other people give you, I think should all be taken with maybe not necessarily a grain of salt, but should be taken into context of how it fits within the style that you like to do. And the best example I have of this is the rule of thirds, right? So we're told that there's this rule, which is ridiculous in art, that we have to put our subjects in very specific places throughout our frame. I don't think that's true at all. I think it's a good guideline to give us an idea of what may or may not be pleasing to the eye. But there are many times like this where I'm going to put that horizon right through the center of the frame because maybe that symmetry worked well for it. Or maybe I wanted to put a subject, on the far corners of the frame because I think that it added to create something unique. And so you need to remember that there are no rules, that it should be fun to experiment. You should want to try to step outside of your comfort zone and learn as much as you can and make those mistakes so that you understand the next time that you go out that there are a lot of opportunities for you guys to create very impactful and meaningful images. And I hope that throughout our talk today, you understood or have begun to understand the value of kind of creating photography with a purpose, with intent, not just taking images because you can, but because you really want to, when you want that image to say something to someone else that may never have that opportunity to be there to witness what you've just photographed. And so putting a bit more of yourself into your work, putting a bit more thought and passion into the choices that you're making out in the field, your choice of camera, your choice of lenses, your choice of aperture, shutter speed, ISO, composition, light, exposure, color, all these elements come together to create unique images. And for me, it's this idea of understanding that an image can be a story, and it could be a direct story, or it could simply have core elements of a story. And I'm going to use that mindset, that platform in order to try to create as compelling images as I can, because I want every single photograph that I take and I share out there with the world to have meaning. And I want other people to at least follow along with that journey and let those images mean whatever they want to them. But if I can't capture their attention to begin with, then I've already lost a bit of that battle. So that's why I think the storytelling side of photography is oh so important. So let me go ahead and stop sharing here. Coming back over.
Okay, awesome. Agreed. I just agreed. You need to do all the things. But I think that something shifted for me too several years ago when I really started to focus on those details a little bit more, even in my just day-to-day travel shots, no matter what camera I'm using to shoot them with, just to really kind of focus on the details and, think of almost every image that I might publish as something that is for a client, even if it's for myself, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, the details matter. The little things all come together. And if you think about all the stuff we just talked about, choice of subject matter, as mundane as that may sound, is important. And all the different little smaller choices you guys make out there in the field all can have big impacts on what that overall feel are. But they're all small little pieces individualized. But once they come together, it can become something special.
Exactly. Okay. Well, thank you for that. We do have a few questions, so we'll take just a couple minutes to kind of go through these. Sure. And two of them are very similar from the same person, so I'm going to kind of take what they asked and kind of shift it a little bit. So a lot of your images, you have some very bright exposures in that your highlights are really bright and vibrant. Could you just maybe share a tip or two on how you do that without going overboard without losing detail and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think a lot of my images, my goal again is to invoke emotion, right? Emotion allows us to think more specifically about something that we're experiencing. And when it comes to photograph, that idea of invoking emotion, capturing someone and having them wow or get sad or angry or just blown away by the beauty of something is that emotional reaction. And a lot of that comes down to that choice of color, whether sometimes I want to go super dark or sometimes I want to go bright. Sometimes, I like to have midtones, but I don't like for everything to be in the middle because then it looks too flat. So a really great tip for those that are watching, especially if you can use it in Capture One or Lightroom. If you capture an image and you want to make sure you capture the right spectrum of light, and sometimes that can be that middle of the ground, mostly midtones. When you're processing the image, you can sit there and, like in Lightroom, for example, when I'm adjusting the white slider, so like the white and the black and sliders essentially adjust the very brightest and the darkest segments of your histogram. So if you take the white slider, that means you're essentially moving that bookend and you're making the brightest pixel in your image brighter. So when you're doing that, if you hold down the Alt on a PC or Command on a Mac, you're going to be able to see when you start clipping your highlights. And so it's going to be subjective depending on what you're photographing and the context of what you're trying to share. But that's a really great way to see if you've pushed things too far where you're seeing too much detail or you're losing too much detail. And then the last little piece I'd give you advice is once you process an image, take that image, hopefully you're using a color calibrated display, but then look at it in a handful of other different displays. Look at it on your phone, maybe you have an iPad or a laptop or other things, and get a feel for how other people might observe it as well. Obviously, you can't control how they control their screens, but sometimes it gives me a bit of perspective or change where I might make some small nuanced adjustments to things like brightness or shadow detail, depending on if I feel on a mobile phone it is not being as well received as it might have been if everyone had, perfectly calibrated displays. So I usually do that at the very end as a last second check, but it can help me sometimes to pick up small nuances that I might have missed otherwise.
Well, and I've started adjusting the brightness on my screen before I post things to Instagram because I feel like a lot of people keep their screens brighter than I might. And just to kind of see, well, what will it look like on a brighter screen? Is it going to be too dark or moody or whatever? That's one of the things that I've been starting to do. Okay. Absolutely. So when you're shooting travel portraits, do you always ask permission? I know that in some countries, you technically have to have permission to photograph people. I lived in Dubai for a while, and I know that if I wanted to photograph people on the street there, you needed to ask permission. So in your experience, what's your approach? Model releases, things like that, are you doing any of that as well?
Absolutely. Well, it's a multifaceted question, so let's go in order. First off, if you're going to use any image for any sort of commercial purpose, selling it, licensing it, anything, you absolutely have to have a model release, assuming your subject is identifiable. So if it's the back of someone's head and they're in a marketplace with hundreds of other people, you don't got to go get hundreds of model releases. However, if you are taking a portrait of someone, then you absolutely need a model release if you ever want to do anything with that, regardless if they're from a developing country or not that may or may not ever known that you've taken it. It is always best practice to have a model release if you plan on doing anything commercial with an image. When it comes to asking, absolutely. I think there is some benefit to candid photography, where you take a picture of someone that's doing something, but what you should do, the ethical thing to do, is after you've taken that candid moment is to go up to that person and to show them the image. And if they have a negative reaction, then show them that you'll delete it. If they do not, then that can work for you. But I think asking, if you're taking a picture of someone purposefully, like if I'm taking a portrait of like the people that I showed you here, absolutely. I think the problem with travel photography in general is the general dehumanizing nature, which comes from tourism and people with cameras. And what I mean by that is that I always try to put myself into someone else's shoes when I try to figure out where are my ethical lines within the travel photography space. And so if I was sitting here in my home and I had some random stranger walk down the street and go into my backyard and then try to take pictures of me or my kids, what would my reaction be, right? If they didn't say anything and they're just taking pictures. I'd say that 9 times out of 10 for anyone that's watching right now, the first thing you'd be doing is calling the police, right?
Right.
So why is it okay for us to do that with people that live in developing countries? It's not. And so you should always ask permission. Now, there are going to be language barriers. I travel to a lot of countries where I do not speak the languages. Papua New Guinea is a great example. There are like 950 actual recognized languages from all the different tribes and villages that are out there. So I get a translator, right? To be able to handle that. If you're working in a place where you can't get a translator, you can't afford it, it's not your style, that's fine. You can get good at professional charades. Nothing says I want to take your camera like
holding up the camera and doing this
and looking like you're confused or something. They're gonna know, and they'll give you permission or they won't. But that allows the relationship to be a bit more of a two-way street rather than some stranger walking up and sticking their camera in your face. So that, like I said, coming back to the line in the sand, if I'm not okay for it to be happening to me, then why would I be okay to do it to another human being? So be a good, a good human being. Make sure that you treat other people like you'd like to be treated, and that generally is going to keep you out of trouble and also getting you better images. I promise you, if you take the time to get to know someone or even just break the ice. I've been times where I've been in places like Nepal or Vietnam where I've been in locations where it's just me and I don't speak good Vietnamese or Nepalese. And I just sit there and I have my camera away. I'm sitting in a square and like you're just sitting there and like over the course of 30 minutes or an hour, like people just get used to you being there and you're there. And then you can either try to have fun talking to them and engaging with them, even if it's just through charades, and it breaks down that ice. And then you can get more real images. You can get more passion and emotion than if you just walked up and we're a bit arrogant and we're like, I'm going to take your picture. I don't care what you say. I'm going to go walk away. Because there's a lot of people that do that. And to be honest, those images are not very good because I think that they've lost a bit of that personal connection that you should have when you photograph another human being.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Okay, well, it's a little bit after 1 p.m., so we are going to wrap this up. Colby, I want to thank you so much for your presentation today. But for those of you tuning in, you get to hang out with us again tomorrow, but we're going to talk a little bit more about your path. Can you tell us just quickly what tomorrow's presentation is about? I've already shared the link in the chat, so you guys who aren't registered can go register. So could you just give us that little tidbit of what tomorrow's going to be about, Colby?
Absolutely. So really what we dive in tomorrow is talking about my creative journey, my pathway of just starting in, falling into photography, getting interested in travel, and how that kind of progressed from travel to landscape to portrait to humanitarian to wildlife, like all the different elements, the lessons I learned along the way, what I learned about myself, what I learned about the world, and kind of how it has created me to be a bit, I don't want to say a bit more unique, but to have a unique flavor for how I approach photography because of all those lessons and because I've shot a wide variety of things professionally throughout the 15 years that I've been doing this. So it's a fun little deep dive. You get to see a lot of, or a handful at least, of images that I never share anywhere else because they're from the early years of Colby Brown's world. But it's fun. And it's good to talk about because it again humanizes things. A lot of people think that, you know, photographers like myself just take nothing but great images. Like we all start somewhere, right? And so you'll see a bit of that tomorrow.
But even in our day-to-day lives, I don't know about you, but even though not every photo we take, even when we've been doing this for a while, is still a great photo. There's always like mistakes or the composition wasn't quite right because sometimes you're just dialing it in or you're photographing someone and they blinked when, you know, the shutter goes off. That never happens, right?
My son does it all the time. Absolutely. 100% right. 100% right. Yeah, I mean, over the years, I found that I think the goal for all of us is obviously never to be 100%. We're never going to get 100% everything that we want all the time. I think it's simply like to have a higher hit rate, right? Like because I've known more about how I like to compose or how I, you know, the gear that I use. I more often than not, you know, have a better chance at coming away with something, but I'm not a guarantee that I'm going to come away with something that's great. I think that's for everyone on your creative journey. That's the goal. It's not to make magic every single time. It is to have a higher percentage of those magic moments and then be able to capture them accurately according to you and share them with other people around the world.
Okay, that's fantastic. So I know the chat apparently is cutting the link off, so just go to glazerscamera.com, go to our events page and you will see all of the upcoming events, including our live session again with Colby tomorrow, our in-store with Hector in a couple of weeks, where you get to check out gear in person and some of the newest gear from Sony. And then just a quick reminder, for those of you who were able to register for today's event, you're going to receive a follow-up email with that super special, only for you who registered discount. So please don't share that, because if you share it, then we won't be able to do this again. So
take those discounts for yourself. Don't share them with everyone else.
Exactly. This is just for you guys who registered. And it's pretty cool because they don't happen very often. So take advantage of it while you can. All right, we're going to wrap this up. Everybody who joined us today, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening for wherever you are around the world. Colby, hang out for just 1 second on the chat after we're done. Hector and Sarah, thank you so much for being online with us today. And have a great day, everybody. We will see you online tomorrow at noon.
Cheers.